Welcome to Simple Entomology for the Fly Tyer and Fly Fisherman, Part 5. I'm Raj Kletke, and today we'll be discussing midges. An occasional trout may be caught with an outlandish fly, but generally we do best with flies that imitate organisms that trout see regularly. Trout see midges every day of the year in all water types and all hours of the day. On an annual basis, trout take more midges than any other organism. So do I start each day with a midge? Of course not. There's often better choices, of which we'll discuss in future videos. However, I always keep midges handy. So what are midges? Midges, as you can see at the bottom of this page, are in the class with other insects. The true midges, the family coronamids, all have aquatic larvae. However, many people generalize the term midge to include all the two-winged or true flies in the order Diptera. We'll keep our entomology very simple and define midges as any small fly that does not fit into another category. This is adequate for the fly fisherman. Midges undergo complete metamorphosis, so let's tie some midges. Midge larvae are small worm-like organisms that may be black, brown, olive, cream color, or even red. Larvae are typically slightly larger than the adult and are embarrassingly simple to tie on either a straight or a curved hook, with either a simple thread wrap or a thread wrap with a rib. However, I don't tie midge larvae as I don't fish with midge larvae. Midge larvae tend to bury themselves in the stream bottom, and with other than the possibility of during behavioral drift are only present in relatively small numbers, and the fish feed only opportunistically on them. When feeding opportunistically, I feel fish will move further for a slightly larger organism. The midge pupa, however, is a totally different story, so let's tie a midge pupa. The first midge pupa we'll tie is one of my favorites, a zebra midge. I am tying it on a size 18 to 20 curved hook. I have a small tungsten bead on the front, but more commonly I use a brass bead. I'm using black thread as that is one of my favorite colors for midge pupa, but any of the colors that we talked about under the midge larva would be acceptable. Once I've layered a base of thread, I add the ribbing, which is a fine silver wire. I place the end of the silver wire in the bead itself, which helps hold the bead in place. I then carry the thread and wire all the way back down the hook, taking it approximately 1/3 to 1/2 the way down the bend of the hook. I think taking this down the bend of the hook adds some micro movement when the hook wobbles, and I think that is enticing to fish. I then bring the thread forward, trying to cover the rest of the silver wire, but adding no dubbing as I want a very thin body. Once I get to the rib tie-off point, I'll add 5 or 6 extra wraps, so that when I reverse wind the rib, the thread will unwind to the rib tie-off point. At which time I then tie off the rib in the usual fashion. As this is a fine wire, I can break the wire off rather than dulling my scissors. I then add a small amount of dubbing to the thread to expand the thorax. Some may consider the zebra midge a larva, but I consider it a pupa, as the big difference between the larva and the pupa is the thorax expansion. So anything with a bead or other thorax expansion I consider a pupa. I then tie off the thread using the whip finisher, and I always tie it off twice so that I do not have to use head cement. I can then cut off the thread, and this is my midge pupa. I commonly use brass bead and other colors, but black thread with a silver ribbing is still my favorite pattern. Midge larvae pupate near the bottom of the stream and then release the pupa in massive numbers that the fish will feed selectively on as they rise slowly in the mid-current to the surface. I feel that most of the midge pupa are concentrated near the bottom of the mid-currents and immediately subsurface, so I tie most of my midge pupa with the brass or tungsten bead and as a surface fly, of which we'll see shortly. However, some also tie midge pupa with a glass bead, as seen here. When tying for the surface or subsurface, you obviously don't want excess weight, so there's no bead, and I've already layered my thread and attached a piece of crystal flash rather than wire to keep the weight to a minimum. Again, I've wound my thread an extra 5 or 6 times at the tie-off point and reverse wind the crystal flash, which now makes up my rib. After binding the rib in place and cutting the excess, I like to add a wing. I usually use white polypropylene, but almost any material that will float is very acceptable. I bind the wing in place and then clip the excess. I then add some dry fly dubbing to the thread, making a very thin amount of dubbing, which I then wind predominantly behind the wing. However, the last little bit of this dubbing I will put in front of the wing where I have saved a little space, and then finish the fly in the usual fashion. After cutting the thread and trimming the wing to the proper length, I have the midge pupa that I fish in the surface or subsurface. I don't worry whether it is hanging vertically or horizontal in the subsurface. As the adult midge emerges from the pupa, some will have trouble breaking through the surface tension, especially if the water is relatively smooth and quiet. Therefore, there will be stillborn midges that some trout will key in on, so I like to tie midge soft hackles on size 18 and smaller. You'll note that in this case I've added a thread base, leaving a small amount of bare hook near the eye of the hook, for reasons of which we'll see shortly. You can add a crystal flash rib if you like. I often do because I like the looks of it, but I'm not sure it adds to the effectiveness. I then use some black dry fly dubbing, because this is a surface fly, to create a thorax. I usually make a slightly oversized thorax, as this helps spread the soft hackle. As this is a small fly, most soft hackles are too large and I need to use the distribution wrap, which I did document in Rotary Vise Techniques. You take a hackle of appropriate color, cut off the center stem, bundle the fibers vertically, measure for length, and then pinch tightly to the far side of the hook. Use your thread tension to rotate or distribute the fibers around the eye of the hook, the bare part of the hook that I left before. Once that's accomplished, you can usually break off the remaining hackle and make a nice small head. I then finish this off in the usual fashion with a whip finisher. As this represents a stillborn, you would normally fish this with a dead drift. However, I do find that occasionally slight movement, such as a soft hackle swing, actually attracts some fish. We still have what could be considered 2 additional stages of midges that we have to discuss. In the next video, Simple Entomology for the Fly Tyer and Fly Fisherman Part 6, we'll discuss these 2 stages, tie at least one more fly, and discuss practical ways of fishing midges. See you soon.